The US doesn't like Africa's partnership with any nation, and especially with China. It is something the US seems to dislike.
The government of China and the people of China are reliable partners of Uganda and of Africa.
But Sierra Leone has openly criticized the United States for scrutinizing Africa's deepening partnership with China, calling Washington's concerns unwarranted and hypocritical. The West, particularly the US, has long framed China's investments in Africa as a strategic threat, warning African nations about so-called debt traps and loss of sovereignty. But African leaders are pushing back, arguing that China provides tangible development, infrastructure, and investment opportunities, something the West has largely failed to do. Sierra Leone's stance reflects a broader reality. African nations are no longer willing to be dictated to about who they can or cannot partner with. While Washington sees China's growing role in Africa as a major geopolitical challenge, Beijing has positioned itself as an economic ally, financing projects that are reshaping the continent. But this raises a bigger question. Why exactly is the US so worried about China's engagement in Africa? What does Washington stand to lose, and what does China stand to gain? Let's find out. For much of modern history, the United States maintained a stronghold over Africa through economic influence, diplomatic pressure, and military partnerships. But today, that grip is slipping. China has steadily built an economic empire across the continent, offering what the US never prioritized: development, infrastructure, and investment without political conditions. Washington now finds itself on the defensive, struggling to maintain influence in a region where China is setting the new rules. Africa is no longer willing to play by America's outdated policies. Leaders across the continent are making choices based on real economic benefits, not Cold War-era alliances, and that has Washington deeply concerned. Since the Cold War, the US viewed Africa as a region to be controlled, not developed. Instead of investing in Africa's economic progress, Washington focused on political influence and military presence. It used international financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank to dictate African economic policies, often forcing governments to accept harsh conditions in exchange for loans. But Africa has changed. Countries are no longer interested in policies that benefit Washington more than they do the continent itself. African leaders are demanding economic partnerships, not lectures on governance, democracy, or human rights. While the US spent decades maintaining its influence through diplomatic control, China took a different approach. Instead of pressuring African nations to align with its ideology, Beijing provided what Africa needed: funding, trade, and large-scale development projects. China's strategy in Africa is simple: build, invest, and expand trade. While the US wasted time debating democracy, China was constructing highways, ports, railways, and energy plants across the continent. Beijing understood what Washington didn't. Africa's future depends on economic growth, not political ideology. China's presence in Africa today is massive and unstoppable. It has signed multi-billion-dollar infrastructure deals, making it the single largest investor in the continent. And unlike US financial institutions, China offers fast, flexible funding with no interference in African politics. Washington has been completely outplayed. China built the African Union headquarters. The US didn't. China financed massive railway projects in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Nigeria. The US refused. China is Africa's largest trading partner. The US has fallen far behind. China provided affordable loans without political conditions. The US insisted on restrictive economic reforms. With these advantages, China has positioned itself as the economic leader in Africa, and Washington can't do much about it. The biggest miscalculation the US made was assuming Africa would always see Washington as its primary partner. But African nations are no longer relying on outdated alliances. They are looking at economic realities and choosing the best partners for their future. Governments across the continent have been vocal in rejecting US interference. Leaders in Burkina Faso, Uganda, and Sierra Leone have openly criticized Washington's attempts to control Africa's economic relationships. Many now see U.S. involvement as a relic of neo-colonialism rather than a true partnership. The U.S. is also losing diplomatic influence. African nations are increasingly siding with China in key UN votes, refusing to follow Washington's lead on global issues. Meanwhile, Western-backed trade agreements are failing to keep up with China's expanding investments. Realizing that it is losing ground, the U.S. has launched desperate countermeasures to regain influence. But so far, these efforts have failed. The Prosper Africa initiative was introduced to increase U.S. trade with Africa. However, compared to China's deep financial commitments, it lacks both funding and impact. The Build Back Better World B3W project was meant to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative. But delays, bureaucracy, and lack of financial support have made it irrelevant. The U.S. has expanded its military presence in Africa through AFRICOM, the United States Africa Command. But military partnerships do nothing to counter China's economic power. Washington is scrambling for solutions, but nothing it offers can match China's momentum. U.S. policymakers now face an uncomfortable reality. They may never regain their dominant position in Africa. Africa is no longer a passive player in global politics. Nations across the continent are making independent choices about their economic futures, and China has positioned itself as the clear alternative to U.S. influence. The U.S. is worried because it has lost control over Africa's decisions. Washington's past tactics no longer work. Africa is looking forward, and for now, that future is tied to Beijing. If the U.S. doesn't change its approach, its role in Africa will continue to shrink until it's no longer a serious competitor at all. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. One of the most important factors when engaging with Africa is how you handle its resources. And China knows exactly what to do. The battle for Africa is not just about trade or political alliances, it is about resources, the fuel of global power. The United States understands that control over natural resources determines the fate of industries, economies, and military capabilities. But in Africa, Washington is no longer in control. China has systematically outmaneuvered the U.S. in securing access to the continent's most strategic minerals, energy reserves, and raw materials. And this has set off alarm bells in Washington. For over a century, Western powers extracted Africa's wealth under colonial rule, ensuring that raw materials flowed into Western economies, while African nations remained underdeveloped. Even after independence, the system remained in place. Africa supplied the materials, and the West controlled the markets. But in the last 2 decades, China has rewritten the rules. Beijing has built direct relationships with African governments, offering them something the U.S. never did: real investments in infrastructure, industry, and long-term resource deals that benefit both sides. Now, the U.S. is facing an uncomfortable truth. It no longer controls Africa's resource wealth. Instead, Washington is watching as China tightens its grip on the materials that are essential for modern technology, defense, and energy. And with each new mining contract, each new energy deal, and each new strategic partnership, the U.S. position weakens. China did not just show up in Africa and start buying minerals. It carefully positioned itself as the continent's most reliable economic partner. While the U.S. spent years issuing warnings about debt traps and governance concerns, Beijing offered direct investments, trade deals, and infrastructure projects that African governments desperately needed. One of China's most effective strategies has been its infrastructure for resources model. Unlike Western financial institutions that demand strict loan conditions and political reforms, China offers African nations a simple deal: access to minerals in exchange for roads, railways, and power plants. This model has allowed Beijing to secure critical resources while also ensuring that its projects support Africa's long-term development. Nowhere is China's dominance more visible than in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, the world's largest producer of cobalt. This mineral is essential for lithium-ion batteries, the technology that powers electric vehicles, smartphones, and renewable energy storage. The DRC produces over 70% of the world's cobalt, and China controls the majority of its extraction and processing. In Zimbabwe, China has taken control of the country's vast lithium reserves, ensuring that Beijing will remain the key supplier of this vital battery metal. In Namibia, Chinese firms are expanding their hold over uranium mines, securing resources for their growing nuclear energy industry. And across East and West Africa, Chinese-backed companies have secured long-term contracts for oil, natural gas, gold, and copper. Meanwhile, the U.S. has struggled to keep up. While American companies still operate in Africa's mining sector, they are rapidly losing ground to Chinese firms. The U.S. government has attempted to counter China's influence through diplomatic pressure and economic agreements. But the reality is that China got there first, and it isn't leaving. The U.S. does not just see China's resource dominance as an economic issue, it sees it as a national security threat. The modern world runs on rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, and other strategic minerals, and many of these resources come from Africa. If China controls the supply, it controls who gets access, at what price, and under what conditions. The consequences of this are enormous. The U.S. military depends on rare earth elements for fighter jets, missile guidance systems, and satellite technology. If China dominates the supply chain, it could restrict American access during a geopolitical conflict, putting Washington in a vulnerable position. The same is true for the tech industry. Silicon Valley giants like Apple, Tesla, and Intel rely on African minerals for their products. If China controls those resources, the U.S. economy becomes dependent on its biggest global rival. The most pressing concern for Washington is that China's dominance in Africa could undermine America's clean energy transition. The Biden administration has prioritized shifting the U.S. toward renewable energy, but this transition requires massive amounts of lithium, cobalt, and rare earth metals. If China controls these materials, it controls the future of U.S. energy policy. Washington has realized too late that it has no leverage. For decades, it assumed Africa's resources would always be available to American industries. But now those same resources are being secured by China under long-term contracts. The U.S. is running out of options, and African governments are refusing to cut ties with Beijing. Recognizing that it is losing control, Washington has launched a series of desperate measures to counter China's resource dominance. The Mineral Security Partnership (MSP) was created to help the U.S. secure alternative supply chains, but it lacks the funding and influence to compete with China's deeply entrenched presence in Africa. Similarly, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation (DFC) has tried to boost mining investments, but American companies are reluctant to engage in Africa's resource sector due to political instability, slow bureaucratic processes, and the difficulty of competing with China's direct state-backed investments. One of Washington's most aggressive tactics has been to pressure African governments to reconsider their deals with China. U.S. diplomats have repeatedly warned countries like the DRC, Zimbabwe, and Zambia that their contracts with Beijing could lead to long-term economic dependency. But these warnings have had little effect. African leaders know that the U.S. is not offering a better alternative, so why would they turn down China's investments? The battle over Africa's resources is not in the future. It is happening right now. And so far, China is winning. Beijing has successfully positioned itself as the dominant player in Africa's mineral, energy, and resource industries, while the U.S. has failed to present a viable alternative. Washington is now dependent on China's goodwill for access to materials that are essential for its economy, technology, and military power. If China decides to restrict exports or raise prices, the U.S. will have no immediate solutions. Africa is no longer the resource colony of the West. It is a continent making its own decisions, and for now, those decisions favor China. If the U.S. does not dramatically change its approach, its influence over Africa's natural wealth will be gone forever. Now let's address the elephant in the room, the debt trap. For years, Washington has pushed a single narrative. China is luring African countries into a debt trap. U.S. officials, Western media, and think tanks constantly warn that Beijing's loans will eventually force African nations to surrender their sovereignty, handing over critical assets to China in exchange for financial relief. This idea of Chinese debt trap diplomacy has become a major talking point in U.S. foreign policy. But there's one big problem. African nations themselves do not see it that way. The reality of Africa's debt is far more complex than Washington's simplistic claims. If there is a debt crisis in Africa, it did not start with China. Western financial institutions, including the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and World Bank, have been lending money to Africa for decades, often under harsher conditions than anything China has ever imposed. The U.S. conveniently ignores the fact that Western-backed loans have kept African nations in cycles of economic dependency for generations. So why does the U.S. keep pushing this debt trap narrative? Because it has no better argument to counter China's success in Africa. Unable to compete with Beijing's economic model, Washington is relying on scare tactics to discourage African governments from working with China. But the numbers and the voices of African leaders tell a very different story. The biggest flaw in the U.S. debt trap narrative is that China is not the primary lender to Africa. Western financial institutions are. According to research from the Africa Policy Research Institute (APROD), IMF and World Bank loans make up the largest share of Africa's external debt, not Chinese loans. African countries owe far more to European and American-controlled institutions than they do to China. For example, as of 2023, about 35% of Africa's total debt is owed to multilateral institutions like the IMF and World Bank. Another 32% is owed to private lenders, mostly Western banks and hedge funds. China holds only about 12% of Africa's total external debt. This means that when Washington accuses China of trapping Africa in debt, it is ignoring the fact that the U.S. and its allies control most of Africa's financial obligations. If there is a real debt crisis, the West bears far more responsibility for it than Beijing. Yet China is the only major lender offering debt restructuring, payment flexibility, and loan renegotiations to African nations, something the U.S. and European banks rarely provide. One of the biggest reasons African governments prefer borrowing from China is that Chinese loans are structured differently than Western loans. Unlike the IMF or World Bank, which impose strict economic conditions, China offers infrastructure-backed loans that help African countries build real assets. China provides loans for development projects like roads, bridges, and energy plants, ensuring that borrowed money goes into tangible infrastructure. Western lenders often give financial aid that is tied to policy reforms, forcing African nations to cut subsidies, privatize industries, or adopt economic policies that favor Western corporations. China allows for loan renegotiations, extensions, and even debt forgiveness, while Western banks demand full repayment, even if it cripples African economies. For African nations, this is not a difficult choice. China's loans come with fewer restrictions, immediate economic benefits, and long-term development prospects. Western loans, on the other hand, come with a history of economic control, austerity measures, and forced privatization. The idea that China traps countries in debt originated in the U.S. and was amplified by Western think tanks and media. The most cited example is the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, where China took control of a port after the Sri Lankan government failed to repay its debts. The U.S. has used this case as proof that China will seize African assets under similar circumstances. However, independent research has debunked this claim. The Hambantota port was not taken over as part of a debt trap scheme. It was leased to China under a negotiated agreement, and the Sri Lankan government retained full sovereignty. Despite this, Washington has continued using the debt trap argument in Africa, even though no African country has ever lost a major asset to China due to loan defaults. The U.S. does not care about Africa's debt. It cares about China's rising influence. By framing China's lending as a threat, Washington hopes to convince African nations to turn away from Beijing. However, this strategy is failing because African leaders are aware of the U.S.'s double standards. If Washington was genuinely concerned about African debt, it would push the IMF and World Bank to cancel or restructure Africa's debts, provide alternative funding for infrastructure projects, and stop imposing harsh economic conditions on African countries that seek financial aid. Instead, the U.S. is trying to scare African governments into rejecting Chinese loans while offering no real solutions. Many African presidents and finance ministers have publicly defended their partnerships with China, rejecting U.S. accusations of debt traps. In 2023, Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni dismissed claims that China was seizing Uganda's national assets, calling it Western propaganda. In Zambia, where debt restructuring was needed, China played a key role in negotiating relief, while Western creditors refused to cooperate. This was a clear example of China being a more flexible lender than the West. Even in Sierra Leone, whose government has been vocal about rejecting U.S. pressure, officials have stated that China's loans have directly contributed to the country's infrastructure growth without the political strings that come with Western aid. Do you think the U.S. has the right to say anything about Africa's partners? Will Africans let the U.S. say anything? Let us know in the comments section. Why can't the U.S. see Africa having new partners? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.